Welcome back to Plan and Manage Schedule. This part turns to adaptive estimating, the way Agile teams size work without predicting exact hours. You will learn how the Fibonacci sequence and a single reference story let a team quickly agree on relative size, complexity, and risk. In this part, you will learn how Agile teams use relative sizing and the Fibonacci sequence to estimate backlog items against a shared reference story. Relative sizing is how Agile teams estimate without measuring hours directly. Instead, they judge a new piece of work against a known reference task, weighing four things at once: effort, complexity, uncertainty, and risk. Most Agile teams score work using the Fibonacci sequence: 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. The gaps between these numbers grow larger as the numbers get bigger, and that growth pattern is intentional, not random. Every team picks one simple, well-understood task as its reference story. Here, updating the company logo becomes the one-point baseline that every future estimate gets measured against. You will compare two new features against that baseline, a Contact Us form and a search engine with autocomplete, and see exactly why one earns a modest point value and the other a much larger one. Finally, you will learn the principle that protects you from a classic exam trap. Story points are relative to one team's own scale, not a universal measure of time, and different teams can score the same story differently. Before comparing stories, let's define exactly what relative sizing measures. Unlike the math-based techniques from earlier in this lesson, relative sizing does not calculate a number from a formula. Instead, a team compares each new piece of work against a known reference task using four lenses. Effort: how much work is actually involved? Complexity: how many moving parts and integrations are involved? Uncertainty: how well understood the requirements are? And risk: what could go wrong along the way? A story that is small in effort but loaded with unknowns can still earn a high point value, because uncertainty and risk count just as much as raw work. This is why story points are not a stopwatch measurement. They are a judgment call, made together as a team, anchored to a shared reference. Agile teams almost always size work using the Fibonacci sequence. Let's look at the numbers themselves and notice something important about the gaps between them. 1 point is your smallest unit, trivial, well-understood work like the reference story you will meet next. It is the yardstick every other estimate gets compared against. 2 points is still a small step up, a 1-point gap. At this end of the scale, the team can tell small differences apart with confidence. 3 points keeps that same 1-point gap. Work at this size is still well understood, just a little more involved than the smallest tasks. Now the gap widens to 2. Once a story moves past simple and well-defined, the team's confidence in a precise number starts to drop, so the scale spreads out. The gap widens again to 3. Bigger stories carry more moving parts and more chances for surprises, so the point values stretch further apart. By 13, the gap has grown to 5. This non-linear spread is deliberate. It forces the team to admit a very large story is genuinely harder to pin down, not just bigger. Let's see relative sizing in action, using one team's actual reference story and 2 new features they need to estimate against it. The team's reference story is updating the company logo on the homepage. Very simple, low complexity, low risk. Everyone understands it completely. The team sets this at 1 story point, and every future story gets compared back to this benchmark. Adding a Contact Us form takes more work than changing a logo. It needs form fields, validation, back-end submission logic, and confirmation messaging. The work is moderately more complex but still well understood, so the team estimates it at 3 story points. Building a search engine with autocomplete is a different scale of problem. It involves advanced search logic, database querying, autocomplete behavior, performance tuning, integration work, and real technical uncertainty. That mix of effort and unknowns earns 13 points, far beyond a simple multiple of the contact form. Put these 2 stories side by side. and the reason for the point gap becomes obvious. The contact form has 4 clear pieces of work, each one familiar to the team. Nothing here is a mystery, so it sits at 3 points. The search feature has 6 demanding dimensions, and several of them, performance tuning, integration complexity, and technical uncertainty, are the kind of unknowns that can blow up an estimate. It is not simply more work than the contact form. It is categorically riskier and harder to pin down. That is exactly why the Fibonacci sequence spreads out at the high end. A jump from 3 to 13 is not saying this story is 4 times bigger. It is saying the team's confidence in any single number is much lower, and the plan should reflect that honestly. Here is the principle that ties everything together. Story points measure relative size, complexity, risk, and uncertainty, never exact duration. A 3-point story does not mean 3 hours, 3 days, or any fixed unit of time. This matters because story points are team relative, not universal. One team's reference story might genuinely be small, giving them a generous baseline, while another team picks a slightly bigger reference task. 2 teams can look at the exact same user story and assign it completely different point values, and both can be correct. What matters is not the absolute number. It is consistency within one team's own scale over time. A team's history of finishing 3-point stories tells you far more about their pace than comparing their points to any other team's numbers. Here is the classic mistake learners make with story points, and it shows up constantly on the exam. The first version is treating a point like a hidden unit of time, assuming 3 points always equals, say, 6 hours. It does not. Points are relative to that team's reference story, not a universal conversion. The second version is comparing teams. Imagine one team averages 40 points per sprint and another averages 20. It is tempting to conclude the second team is half as productive, but that conclusion is wrong. Their reference stories and their scales are simply different. The correct response is to judge each team against its own trend over time. Are they finishing what they commit to? And is their pace stable or improving? Never use points as a stick to compare one team against another. Story points let Agile teams size work fast, using a shared reference and the Fibonacci scale to capture effort, complexity, uncertainty, and risk all at once. Remember, the widening gaps in the sequence are intentional, and a story's point value only means something relative to that one team's own baseline. That's it for this lesson. See you in the next lesson.